because history is so important. You know, I think in today's world, it seems a little bit polarized. You know, we either try to suppress history, which isn't good, or we look at history as, you know, something that happened centuries ago, and we want to blame people for centuries to come, which isn't the way to create a better world. And, you know, I think it was probably Gandhi who said that, you know, it's quite easy to protest. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't protest, you know, it's good to protest, but that's the easy part. And the hard part is to build up a better society, a just society and a better society. And I think this is what history helps us to do. So this is nothing to do with this story at all, I have to say. And in fact, this history delves into aspects of the First World War as well. And, you know, I think certainly, though, we can learn from the lessons of history how not to repeat mistakes that we've made, you know, in the past. This is Wellesley Tudor Pole and Abdul Baha, you know, of the Bahai faith. So these two men, they were 40 years apart in age. Abdul Baha was born on the 23rd of May, 1844. Wellesley Tudor Pole was born on the 27th of April, 1884. So more or less 40 years later. And there was absolutely no reason why these two men should meet. Abdul Baha was born in Tehran, in Iran. I'll show you a map of that in a moment. Wellesley Tudor Pole was born in Weston-super-Mare in Britain and in England. So let's just have a little look at Abdul Baha first. For Baha'is, he's the perfect exemplar of the Baha'i faith, not a prophet. I'll speak a little bit later on about his visits to Europe and to North America, and people called him a prophet. If you Google Abdul Baha, you will see newspaper articles from the day, and he's called a prophet, and he doesn't describe himself as such at all. He says Abdul Baha means servant of the glory, and he says, my name is Abdul Baha, service, my identity is Abdul Baha, my qualification is Abdul Baha. And we can only really know him through what people have said of him. And there was a man called Myron Phelps, who was not a Baha'i. He was a lawyer at the New York bar, and he visited Abdul Baha in Akka in the early 1900s. And this is what he said of him. He said, above is the bright sun of Palestine. To the right, a glimpse of the old sea wall and the blue Mediterranean. It is, as we sit, we hear a singular sound rising from the pavement. It is like the murmur of human voices. We open the window and look down. We see a crowd of human beings with patched and tattered garments. Let us descend into the streets and see who these are. Many of these men are blind, many more are pale, emaciated or aged. Most of the women are closely veiled, but enough are uncovered to cause us to believe that if the veils were lifted, more pain and misery would be seen. Some of them carry babes with pinched and sallow faces. We do not have to wait long. A door opens and a man comes out. He is of middle stature, strongly built. He wears light-coloured robes. On his head is a light buff fez with a white cloth wound about it. He is perhaps 60 years of age. His long grey hair rests on his shoulders. His forehead is broad, full and high. His nose slightly aquiline. His eyes are. I'm getting a. Can you hear that? Okay, feedback there. Okay. Yeah.
Somebody needs to mute.
It's fine. It was Steve. I muted him.
His eyes are grey and blue, large and both soft and penetrating. His bearing is simple, but there is a grace and dignity, even majesty. He stations himself at the narrow angle of the street and motions to the people to come upwards to him. In each open palm he places some small coins. He knows them all. and so they pass him each day. This scene you might see almost any day of the year in the streets of Akka. There are other scenes like it which come only at the beginning of the winter season. So basically, Abdul Baha was the incarnate of every perfect virtue. He was kind to the poor, he was practical, he had a special mission to give to the world. Meanwhile, actually I'll just pop to slide 2 while we're on Abdul Baha. Okay, I'm aware that many people here will perhaps never have heard of the Baha'i faith or know the background to Abdul Baha. So if the Baha'is will just bear with me for a moment while I just go through this. Abdul Baha, his father was Baha'u'llah, who was the founder of the Baha'i faith, and they were from Iran in the middle of the 1800s. Now, like any faith that you might look into, like any faith at all, at its inception, the prophets come with a pure message, but they are persecuted by the prevailing people. Most of you will have come across Christianity, perhaps be Christian, and you will know that in the time of Jesus, he came with a very pure message, and yet he was reviled, he was punished, he was eventually crucified. And this was the same with Baha'u'llah, who came with a message of peace and unity for the world. The early Baha'is were reviled, they were persecuted, many thousands of them were martyred and killed. The earliest British people, I think, to come across the Baha'is, because remember it was only in the mid-1800s, was Lord Curtson of Kedleston. Lord Curtson, in his 20s, travelled extensively. He travelled throughout Persia, and he wrote a great tome called Persia and the Persian Question. And he wrote extensively about the suffering of these early Baha'is and his admiration for them. He said, basically, these are very peace-loving people. They have committed no crime, and yet they're being persecuted. Alongside Lord Curtson was Edward Granville Brown, who was actually trained as a medical doctor at Cambridge, but he became an Orientalist. He also travelled out to Persia, and he met Baha'u'llah, and he's written about him. And many of his writings are, today at the British Library and Cambridge University. So basically, attempts were made on Baha'u'llah's life and the Holy Family. They didn't quite succeed, so they were banished to modern-day Baghdad. They stayed there for a while, but again, there were more and more adherents to this new faith, and so they made a further banishment, taking them up to Adrianople and Constantinople. And there are links here in a moment with Wellesley Tudor Pole. But still, they couldn't suppress this new religion at all. It just wasn't, it was actually growing. I think Lord Curtson felt that there were about 1 million adherents to the Baha'i faith in Iran. And so again, attempts were made on Baha'u'llah's life. They didn't succeed. So eventually they thought, okay, we're just going to banish these people to what was known as Palestine. It's now known as Israel. To the north of Israel, in Akka, there was a prison by the sea, and nobody came out of this prison alive. And so they were banished there. They stayed there, and again, they carried on. Pilgrims would come to try and visit them, and eventually they were released, and Baha'u'llah went to Mount Carmel, and that is where is the centre of the Baha'i faith today. So that's just a little synopsis. Sorry, it's a very, very long story, but just to give you a very brief synopsis there. Okay, so how does Wellesley Tudor Pole come into this story? Wellesley Tudor Pole was a Christian man. He was a very pure-hearted person, I think. He questioned a lot. When he was a young boy, when he went to school, he always wanted to ask questions about the Bible, about things he didn't understand in the Old Testament, and he would ask his teachers. And you imagine in the Edwardian days, the beginning of the Victorian era, the teachers were not sympathetic. They wouldn't answer his questions. They told him, when when he asked questions about the Old Testament, they told him to leave it and read the new one. And, you know, he just didn't get any help at all. He went to Blundell's public school. The Tudor Poles hailed from Wales on his mother's side. And the unusual thing about this family, the Tudor Poles, was that they were all very psychic. They were like, you know, a psychic family. Now, I'm somebody who's never had a psychic thought in her life. I've never had a significant dream. I would love to have had significant dreams, but I haven't had one. And Wellesley Tudor Pole was extremely psychic, as were his father and mother, his brothers and sisters. So, for example, when he went into a church and people were praying, he would apparently see the colours of prayer rising up, you know, that sort of thing. So that was, you know, quite an interesting aspect of his life. The family were kind of landed gentry, you know, middle of the road. They were, although they were psychic, they had quite regular, they were business people, basically. And so when Tudor Pole left school, he got involved in importing flour and making biscuits, basically. That was his business. Okay, so it's just... Okay, so let's just move on there with Tudor Pole. Okay, so when he was a young man, he'd started his business. He was he lived in Bristol, in Glastonbury, and basically in his search to find a purer form of Christianity, he was searching for the Holy Grail. So from this point onwards, we can think Raiders of the Lost Ark, we can think The Lord of the Rings, or even Hercule Poirot comes to mind, because this story of the early days of Tudor Pole in his early 20s seemed quite fantastic in a way. He was desperate to find, you know, some original writings from the time of Christ, and guided by his psychic visions. It all sounds very fantastic, but it's all here in his, you know, his biography, written by a guy called Jerry Fenge. He was looking for the Grail that belonged to Christ, that Christ used at the Last Supper. And through a series of psychic visions and all the rest of it, he felt that he had discovered the Grail in Glastonbury, along with his sister Mary, in one of the holy wells. They dug very deep through layers of mud, and they came up with a cup, a glass cup. Now, this cup was never actually proved to be the Holy Grail at all, and how it would have arrived in Glastonbury, I don't know. But anyway, they felt it to be quite, you know, it was quite a spiritual thing for them to find this cup. And I have to say that members of the establishment at the time, they took them quite seriously. You know, in fact, when it was tested by people, it didn't hold weight, really. It wasn't old enough, for one thing. But there were meetings that were held where they looked into the cup and looked into the history of it. Archbishop Wilberforce, you know, was quite interested in this cup. And Tudor Pole kept it in his home in Bristol. It was kept there, and it was just kept in a special place. So in a sense, he then started on his quests, and he was actually doing them a little bit in reverse. Normally, if you look at King Arthur and his knights and these kind of stories, when people were going on quests, or Lord of the Rings, they were looking for the ring, they were looking for the cup. Not so with Tudor Pole. He'd already got the cup, but what he wanted to do was to go out east, to go out to Turkey and Constantinople and these places, and to find original Christian documents that would prove that the cup that he had found, that it would give some validity. And also, he was really keen to find some of the early Christian writings, which he felt if he could find them, this would give him a reason for, you know, cutting through all the ritual that he didn't like in Christianity, finding this purer form. So, of course, what does he do? He goes off on the Orient Express. He was only 23 years of age. He finds himself in Constantinople in Turkey. I think the early 1900s was a very interesting time. I'm very interested in it myself as a period of history. It was a time of great adventure. It was Scott of the Antarctic. It was Gertrude Bell. It was the time of Lawrence of Arabia, all of these people. And there was a great sense of adventure. Now, Tudor Pole, when he went out to Turkey, he didn't take anything with him. He had no notes, no maps, nothing. It was purely on his intuitive hunches that he felt he would find what he was looking for out there. He was particularly interested in this church, the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. This church is still there. It's a museum now, actually, and it has passed through various hands. It's belonged to Muslims. It's belonged to Christians over its history. And what he was particularly interested in when he arrived there in Istanbul, he then, just down the road from the Hagia Sophia was Seraglio Palace. Now, Seraglio Palace was where the last Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, and on the map that I just showed you, the large green area was the whole of the Ottoman Empire. Now, the Ottoman Empire was coming to a close. The Sultan Abdul Hamid, he was the last of the sultans from this era, and there was a lot of turmoil, a lot of political unrest. But Seraglio Palace was just down the road from Hagia Sophia, and this was exactly where Tudor Pole felt he had to be to find his these parchments from the early Christian era. Okay, now the rest of it really does read like something from Poirot. The Seraglio Palace that I just showed you is closely guarded. It held the Sultan's harem, were inside there, closely guarded by Nubian eunuchs. And but Tudor Pole wishes to go inside there. It's very, very dangerous. Every second person in Istanbul at this period would be a spy. It was a very dangerous place for foreigners to move about freely. It was a place of rumour and intrigue. Tudor Pole had very, very little knowledge about the historical or geographical conditions of the area. There was no internet at the time, no mobile phones. He managed to find himself an interpreter. The interpreter was called Bryant, and Bryant, Tudor Pole often refers to him as X in his writings. Bryant knew a gardener who was inside Seraglio Palace, so he managed to get Tudor Pole inside. So Tudor Pole gets inside Seraglio Palace, very dangerous. If he's caught, he could be shot. He finds the exact spot where he thinks he needs to dig. He's got no archaeologist with him, very little archaeological knowledge himself, and he begins to dig. He comes across a marble slab and he can't get any further, but he's not deterred. He tries to dig around the marble slab. Bryant is with him, he's waiting, in the wings, and then Tudor Pole manages to dig himself in a little deeper. He goes down as far as he can, but then he realises that he can't get any further, that he would need dynamite. He comes up to the surface and there's Bryant waiting for him, and Bryant is in altercation. He's having an argument with the Nubian eunuchs from the harem, and basically, the two of them are marched out of Seraglio Palace. The guards marched them out. They were very lucky not to have been shot on sight. This is what could have happened, in those days, in those times, and they're marched out through the front gate of Seraglio Palace. Tudor Pole feels frustrated because he's sure that this is the place where he will find his documents, and he's sure of the liberating effect on the world if only these documents can be found. he just feels it would completely open up Christianity if he could find them. So after this, Tudor Pole returns to England. He's not, I think, you know, the other thing about the early 1900s is they don't seem to have had a sense of failure, or, you know, they were pretty resilient. He didn't return home very disappointed. He was apparently in fine spirits. He was very happy to have discovered the place where he thought these parchments would be found, even though he hadn't found them. That didn't put him off. This was in 1907. And meanwhile, Abdul Baha, who we hadn't met yet, was in Haifa. These were dangerous times for Abdul Baha because of the fall of the Ottoman Empire. You know, quite honestly, in these times of political turbulence, people always wanted to find a scapegoat. And Abdul Baha, the Sultan Abdul Hamid, had sent a commission to Haifa to look into the affairs of Abdul Baha, you know, a man of peace, who gave to the poor each day. But and the Baha'is were very worried because they'd heard that the commission who were coming were planning to take Abdul Baha and to banish him once more into the desert in Libya, in Tripolitania. And, you know, Abdul Baha had many friends by now. Even the prison guards in Akka and Haifa were friends with Abdul Baha. They knew him to be a very sincere man of peace. And the Italian consul came rushing to Abdul Baha and offering to take him away from the danger of this commission who were coming. But Abdul Baha said no, he would not leave Haifa. And in fact, during this time, and just after Tudor Pole had been in Constantinople, there was a bomb attack on the life of the Sultan, and the ship that came to take Abdul Baha, they turned around and went back again. So Abdul Baha was okay for that time. Okay, I'll just go back onto the screen again, just back to December 1907. Tudor Pole decides it's time to make another quest, another visit out to Turkey. Off he goes again on the Orient Express. And now this particular story, when I read it in his biography, it sounds crazy. Yeah, I love Poirot. If any of you like Poirot, you will really relate to this story. So Tudor Pole, having been out, remember he's very young, he's only in his early 20s, having been out once to Turkey and realising all the intrigue that goes on, he knows that the people will be on the lookout for him this time when he goes out for a second time. So he just decides to go out in disguise. So he leaves England with a false beard. He puts on a false beard. I don't know why he didn't just grow a beard himself, but he doesn't. He puts on a false beard. And when he gets onto the Orient Express and he eats his soup, the beard falls into the soup and he's exposed there and then before he's even got anywhere. This story seems really crazy to me. But anyway, that's what he did. He wanted to be a little bit more incognito because a foreign person in those days in Turkey, in Constantinople, is quite a dangerous place to be. Okay, so he, this time when he went out, apart from just going to the Seraglio Palace, well, he decided it would be too difficult to get back into the Seraglio Palace. So what he did was he decided to go and meet some of the local people, which he did. He went into coffee houses and stuff. And in one of these coffee houses, he recounts in one of his letters later on in life, he said, "I was sitting in a walled garden of a Istanbul inn, drinking with a group of young Turks drinking coffee. It was a cold night and we had a charcoal brazier placed near our table. Then hot, black, sweet Turkish coffee was served, and as guest of honour, I was given the first cup to drink. I put it to my lips but did not drink. One of my hosts, sitting on my right, then drank his cup and fell dead at our feet. Immediately, the man next to him swept the tray of cups and coffee to the ground, and then they all jumped away to the darkness of the night. They were Ataturks, young Turks, and the year was 1908. It was the Sultan's spies who had bribed the innkeeper and served the coffee themselves. So by this time, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire had been deposed. Istanbul was full of intrigue, espionage, counter-espionage, and these kind of murders were quite routine. So Tudor Pole was very lucky not to have lost his life then. In another letter, he recounts, another attempt was made on his life. A wild dog saved my life. In old Istanbul, when a Turk was waiting in a doorway to jump out and knife me, I stepped by accident on a dog lying in a hole in the street. Its yelp made me lurch forward violently, and the knife missed me by several inches. So, you know, dangerous times out there. What he did this time was he turned his attention to the house of Justinian, which was a library by the sea. Now, Justinian was a great cataloguer, if I can say that word, and he was sure, Tudor Pole was sure that he'd find some scripts there, and he penetrated the tomb. It was along the sea, there were catacombs going down. He went into the hallway. Some local fishermen had already penetrated into this crypt, and but they were fearful of going back and they wouldn't go with him. So he went as far as he could. He then came back, and again his mission failed, but he wasn't deterred, and he now returned to England, knowing that he would probably never get permission to excavate in Istanbul, but he was just ever hopeful, you know, for the future. Okay, so let's now look to his third quest, the third quest. Yeah, okay, so this is Tudor Pole's third quest. So this one was a little bit different. I think he realised that he wasn't going to be able to dig when he got out to Istanbul. So his itinerary for this time was to go to Smyrna in Western Turkey and Damascus, modern-day Syria, and also he was going to go to Vienna. The reason for going to Vienna was to scour the museums where he hoped to get information on his cup. So that was his thoughts. But this journey was a little bit different because while he was in the East on other trips, he'd heard that there was a holy man called Abdul Baha, and Wealthy Tudor Pole, as part of his spiritual journey, spiritual quest, he wanted to meet Abdul Baha. And Abdul Baha, in fact, by now was no longer in Haifa. He'd come down to Alexandria in Egypt, because Abdul Baha was about to embark on journeys to the west. And so Tudor Pole went on his trip now, and he met Abdul Baha. He sailed from Marseille to Alexandria, and he met Abdul Baha. And I'll read you this account. Okay, so this is Tudor Pole arriving in Alexandria. He wanted to seek out a holy man he had heard of when last in the East. This man had been imprisoned for over 40 years, and people revered him so much they would stand outside his prison walls in Akka, hoping for a blessing. Since the Young Turkish Revolution, the holy man had been released and was now staying at Ramley, near Alexandria. The man's name was Abdul Baha. He was the son of Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Baha'i movement. It took Tudor Pole a while to find him at Ramley, but once he succeeded, he was able to verify the extraordinary power of Abdul Baha's presence, despite the difficulties of a language barrier. Now, this is Abdul Baha's letter that he wrote. He said, "I speak no Persian and my knowledge of Arabic is rudimentary." So our conversation carried on through Abdul Baha's grandson, who the Baha'is will know was Shoghi Effendi, acting as interpreter. At one point, his grandson was called away but I felt that I carried on my conversation with Abdul Baha. And in fact, although Tudor Pole didn't know the language, when Abdul Baha's grandson came back, Tudor Pole checked what was said, and it seemed like they conversed even without knowing each other's language, which is quite interesting. So on the second day, he went back to visit Abdul Baha. Now, this is where things get a bit interesting, okay? Because he goes back to visit Abdul Baha, and then Abdul Baha asks Tudor Pole if he would mind going, not only going back to Marseille, but going back to Paris, because he had a job for him to do. And, you know, Tudor Pole, he sort of thinks about this. And, you know, he sleeps on it that night, and he thinks like any of us, really. We've got our itinerary. After this, he was going on to Vienna, he was going on to Syria, you know, all these places. And he said, now, this man who I've just met, he's requesting me to go back to Paris. You know, I'm not sure what I think about this. And he goes back to Abdul Baha the next day, and, you know, Abdul Baha, you know, then explains what the service is, what he would like him to do. And Abdul Baha said, well, let me read it to you from the book. Yeah. So Abdul Baha handed me £10 in gold and asked me to give this sum to a Persian student believed to be in Paris, whose name was Tamadan al-Mulk, with the request that he should proceed at once from Paris to Ramleh. In those days, you could travel for very far for small sums of money. So Tudor Pole accepted the commission. You know, he wasn't sure why, but he did accept to do this, you know, for Abdul Baha. And the next day, he found himself going back to Marseille. So on reaching Paris, very typical of this era as well, he had no address, he had the student's name, but he didn't know anything more than that. This student was a languages student in the early 1900s in Paris, and Abdul Baha, who was about to embark on his travels to the West, he wanted the student to come back because he was going to be his interpreter. So again, this is from the Russell papers. These are papers, Tudor Pole's letters, that you can actually find them in St Andrews University in Scotland. In fact, prior to the lockdown, that was one of my own plans. I was going to go up to St Andrews University to look through Tudor Pole's papers up there. But nonetheless, they are reproduced here in his biography. So Tudor Pole says, on reaching Paris, I went to the Persian consulate to find the address of Tamad al-Mulk, but unsuccessfully. I went to the Oriental quarters, the students' quarters on the south bank of the river, but no success. So he'd come all the way back to Paris, he'd gone to the student quarters, he'd gone to the consulate, and he couldn't find Tamad al-Mulk anywhere. So let's just put ourselves in Tudor Pole's shoes. He'd come all the way back from his third visit, and to no avail. He couldn't find this student. He's frustrated by this. He's still got the 10 gold coins in his on his person, and he just thinks to himself, okay, right, I might as well just go back to London now. I'm in Paris, so I'll go back to London. So he catches the train and he goes back to the Gare du Nord. When he arrives at the Gare du Nord, he sees a young Persian man wearing the usual fez, carrying a white stick. And he actually goes up to him and he says to the young man, I'm looking for someone called Tamad al-Mulk. And the young man says to him, that's me. I am Tamad al-Mulk. And, Tudor Pole, he just can't believe this. And the young man he's just come back from Vienna, where he's been to have operations on his eyes because he's almost blind. He's almost lost his eyesight. And that's why he wasn't in Paris. He'd gone to have operations on his eyes. And Tudor Pole says to him, I have come from Abdul Baha, and Abdul Baha would like you to go back to Ramleh, because, he's about to begin his travels, and, you know the English and French language. And, he would like you to translate. And Tamadil's face just radiated with joy when he heard this. and he said, I will do this straight away. I will go back, you know, to Ramleh. So Tudor Pole had fulfilled his mission. It seems amazing, but he did. And that's why this talk is called The Wonderful World of Tudor Pole and Abdul Baha, because this just seems quite an amazing thing to happen. So Tudor Pole carries on this time. He goes back to Bristol, which is where he lived. And in fact, Tudor Pole, he did run a business, as I said. It was producing biscuits, importing flowers. And if Tudor Pole hadn't arrived back at that particular moment, his business would have gone under, you know, without going into the details about it. So it was all, you know, kind of meant to be. So this is just setting the scene of Tudor Pole's relationship with Abdul Baha. So let's roll on to 1911. And this is Abdul Baha's arrives in Britain on September the 10th, 1911. Now, friends, let's just look at this. Abdul Baha was by now 68 years old. His whole life had been one of privation and banishments. From being a young child, less than 8 years old, he had shared all of these banishments with the Holy Family. They didn't have enough food to eat. At one time, his mother would just give him just a handful of flour. There was nothing to eat. And he was always serving other people. Abdul Baha, when he was a young person, he was a good horseman. And during the banishments, he didn't want to sleep so that he could help everybody else, so that he could find food for everybody else. When they left Baghdad, it was in 1863, and he was a young man of 19 years old. He would ride his horse at full pelt to go ahead of the caravanserai. He would then lie down with his horse, put his head on the horse's head, and that was the only way he got any sleep at all. So his life had been like this, but now at 68 years old, he now wants to travel to the West. He's never given a public talk or sermon. He's never attended school particularly, but he arrives in London. He gives a talk at the City Temple in Holborn to 5,000 people. He's welcomed by archbishops, by rabbis, by chancellors of university, by philosophers. He met Alexander Bell in America, who invented the telephone. He and he would also seek out the poor in the West. He was a man from the East, but wherever he went, he would seek out the poor and try and help them wherever they were. And this quote is just, this just kind of summarizes the sort of message that Abdul Baha wished. I'll just try and bring it up here, so I can read it. The cycle of human power. It is the hour of unity, the drawing together of all races and classes. The gift of God to this enlightened age is the oneness of religion. And Abdul Baha, whilst being quite realistic, he knew that the troubled times were ahead, in the early 1900s, but that a most great peace would come. Now, to show you the special relationship between Abdul Baha and Wellesley Tudor Pole, when Abdul Baha travelled, he didn't tend to stay with people. He preferred to be, independent. He looked after himself. He paid for himself. He would take nothing from anybody. He left no footprint, if you like. But of course, because he'd got this relationship by now with Wellesley Tudor Pole, the young Wellesley Tudor Pole, he did agree to stay with him in Bristol. And this is a picture of Wellesley Tudor Pole, his first visit to Bristol in 1911. At Wellesley Tudor Pole's home, it was a bit of a centre because of his quests, because of the cup that was there. It was a bit of a centre. And actually Glastonbury, near to Bristol, it still is in that sense. They would hold meetings, people would come to see what they thought was the Holy Grail. In fact, Wellesley Tudor Pole showed Abdul Baha the Holy Grail, and Abdul Baha, respectful as always, he held this grail in his hand and he blessed it and he gave it back to him, and he didn't, say a word about it. Now, this is outside, this is in Clifton, this is Abdul Baha on the balcony there. This is Tamad al-Mulk, and this is Wellesley Tudor Pole. So this is the Persian young student who Wellesley Tudor Pole met at the Gare du Nord, who returned back to translate for Abdul Baha on his journeys through the West. And Abdul Baha gave talks at Wellesley Tudor Pole's home. There would be about 80 people there each time. He spoke of the pervading love and friendship between the East and the West. And Abdul Baha, interestingly, went around this apartment. He blessed each room. He promised that this apartment would be a centre of peace and rest for pilgrims from the East and from the West. And interestingly enough, the Baha'is of Great Britain have in the last couple of years, have bought this apartment, and as we speak, it's being done up into a centre. It will be a pilgrimage centre for people. I have actually visited this apartment before it was done up, and it was lovely to go there, knowing that Abdul Baha had stayed there. So from Abdul Baha travelled extensively. Again, friends, bearing in mind, that he was so elderly. He travelled extensively. He went to Paris, to Germany, to Hungary, all around Europe. He went back to Alexandria, and he then came back and visited the United States of America. Again, a very tough tour of America. He went from west to east. He travelled on the trains. He would always travel third class. He never travelled first class. And quite an interesting story. When Abdul Baha, after he'd visited Britain for the first time and he went back, the early Baha'is in America, they tended to be fairly wealthy. This is no longer the case. It was in the early days. I guess it was the wealthy people who were into religions from the East or whatever. And they wanted him to travel on the Titanic to come to America, because the Titanic was regarded as the best, the fastest ship of the time. But Abdul Baha, in his simplicity, he said, no, I don't want to travel on this ship. And he travelled on the Cedric. And of course, we all know the story of the Titanic. I mean, Abdul Baha, I'll just go back to the previous slide. Abdul Baha famously possessed one coat. He would not possess anything more than one coat, even when his coat became threadbare and people insisted and would give him a new coat, he just didn't want to accept it. That was the total sum of his possessions, of his clothes. And here he is in America, and in the light of recent things in the news, Abdul Baha was very conscious of the need to unite all races in the world, and he absolutely encouraged the early Baha'is in America to call Race Amity Conferences, and the first one did take place in Washington in 1921. And it carried on each year. So you imagine in 1921, this was way before Martin Luther King and way before, it was when there was absolute segregation in the United States. But the early Baha'is were really, trying to plant these seeds about, bringing all the races together. And this was the desire of Abdul Baha. So after America, Abdul Baha comes back to Britain. He stops off in Bristol in 1913 for the last time. And this was, again, very typical of speeches and talks he would give. Religion should unite all hearts and cause wars and disputes to vanish from the face of the earth. It should give birth to spirituality and bring light and life to every soul. If it's a cause of hatred, it's better not to have any religion. It should be a cause of love and unity. Okay, so racing on. Okay, by this time, 1913, you all know pretty much what's going to follow. The First World War, the outbreak of the First World War is in 1914. So Abdul Baha travels back, he goes back to Haifa in the north of Palestine, and that's where he is for the entire length of the war. But this connection with him and Tudor Pole does not stop there. Okay, we go on to the war years. So basically, Tudor Pole could have been exempt from the war because of his business. Because his business was producing biscuits, which provided rations for British troops, he could have been exempted. And he was a pacifist, actually, but somehow, you know, he felt he had a part to play in the war. And going back to his family and the psychic nature of his family, they all agreed, you know, his mother, father, brothers and sisters, they all agreed that he should go to this war and that he would have a special mission to fulfill during this war. So that was his guide. All the quests to Istanbul were purely intuitive, psychic kind of guides, and so was him joining up for the First World War. Okay, he joined the Marine training and had a terrible time. He felt it was brutal, you know, was the way he described it. He then joins officer training, and he's fully expecting to be posted to France, to Europe, to the Western Front. But in fact, his posting isn't to Europe, his posting is to Palestine. And on November 1917, he finds himself en route on a ship from Plymouth to Cairo. Once he okay, so so he's now in Palestine, and he's a young officer, and you know, these descriptions of the First World War, we can so understand why. I think at the beginning I said that from history we have to learn the lessons to go into the future. And those of you who like First World War poetry like I do, or know the history of any war, we just really see the futility of it. I think it was Confucius who said, a soldier's triumph should be conducted as a funeral. You know, who wins in war? It's all people, it's all humanity, they're all people. But nonetheless, the First World War, they go out to, there's a battle in Jerusalem. The Turks have joined up with the German forces, and then the British are out there, and they're all fighting against each other. Now, the battle for Jerusalem was more or less because they call it the Battle of Blood over Water, because so much blood was spilt, and there were two wells on the outskirts of Jerusalem, and for war you need water, and they were literally fighting over these two wells. And Tudor Pole finds himself in a battle in Jerusalem. He's an officer. They're going forwards, you know, in this battle up this hill, and the wells are on the other side. Well, I'll read you from the book. I'll read you from the book. It describes it, you know, better than I can. Okay, they're going forward. Tudor Pole was very popular with his men, and they trusted him. They were moving forwards up the hill. He had to stand up to see what was happening and where to direct the men to fire. They were all splendid, but very, very scared and longing to withdraw. The bombs were sent over to us. We pitched them more or less blindly. Okay, so they're gradually moving forwards up the hill. Then all of a sudden, Tudor Pole feels a sudden premonition. He sees a sniper in a fig tree. The sniper in the fig tree sniped, and I fell on my knees, struck through the upper left arm and shoulder. And Tudor Pole, so basically he's been shot. The bullet goes straight through him. It doesn't hit any vital organs. He felt he felt anger rather than pain. He thought he was so sure that he had a special mission to fulfill out in Palestine, and now he's being shot. He lies on the ground. His sergeant comes over to him to check that he's okay, and the sergeant is shot. The sergeant dies, and he falls on top of Tudor Pole. But this is what actually saved Tudor Pole's life. The Turks then come over for a while, they check and they pick off anyone else who hasn't died, but of course they think Tudor Pole has died. When it all quietens down, Tudor Pole is alive and he manages to escape. He manages to get himself to a clearing station. He then travels for 6.5 hours on a camel, agonizing hours. He's in pain, but he's alive. Finally, he gets to another clearing station, and then he's taken in a cattle truck to Nasrieh Hospital, military hospital in Cairo. He arrives there, and then he's cared for there, and he doesn't return back to the battlefield. Interestingly, Tudor Pole was a vegetarian, and in his accounts of being in Nasrieh Hospital, he just speaks of being given food but sticking to his vegetarian principles and not eating the meat. Okay, so meanwhile, the head of British forces at the time in Jerusalem was General Allenby, and the British took Jerusalem. General Allenby walks into Jerusalem in December 1917. So the battles continue, and Tudor Pole, we haven't got too far to go now, by the way. Tudor Pole, like many recently wounded officers, he gets involved with the intelligence service in Cairo. And by this time, he now is fully aware that he thinks of Abdul Baha, his friend, who's in the north of the country, and he's aware, through being in intelligence and getting information from behind Turkish lines, Jamal Pasha, who is the head of the Young Turks, he has sent out a threat to kill Abdul Baha. And so Tudor Pole is very worried now. He knows that Abdul Baha's life is in danger. So basically, his own superior officers are not interested in the case. He tries to explain that Abdul Baha is a very important international man of peace, and it's up to the British to protect him. So he hears nothing from them. So then he decides to write to Sir Mark Sykes back in Britain. He tells them that the Baha'i leader, Sir Mark Sykes, by the way, was an MP, a member of Parliament back in Britain. He says the Baha'i leader and his family are in imminent danger, and at the moment, of course, are powerless. His prestige is not understood among the authorities here. It is not even realised that he controls a remarkable religious movement, wholly devoid of political and military associations, which can number many millions of adherents throughout the Near and Middle East. Jews, Muslims, Christians, Parsis, Hindus and Kurds unite under the Baha'i banner of spiritual fellowship. Is it too much to ask for us to afford protection to him? So that was his letter to Sir Mark Sykes. He didn't hear anything back from him, and it took 43 letters for the letter to reach him. So at considerable danger to himself, Tudor Pole then runs into a Foreign Office official in a sports club in Alexandria, Major David Ormsby. He writes a letter which he asks David Ormsby to take back to England by hand. This is very risky because it's smuggling an uncensored letter and you can be court-martialed for that. So the letter goes to, well, I can tell you the actual route that the letter goes. The letter goes to Lady Paget, who sent it on to her son-in-law, Lord Plymouth, who sent it on to Lord Balfour, who was a member of the War Cabinet, and he put it on the agenda of a meeting in which he, the Prime Minister and Lord Curzon were would be alerted to the danger to Abdul Baha. And of course, so they discuss it, and also a letter goes to Frederick White, who's a member of Parliament, and he knows that Lord Curzon was very deeply impressed with the Baha'i movement in Persia itself, and he may be willing to interest himself in the matter now. So you have influential people, and because Lord Curzon knew of the early Baha'i movement and respected it, so eventually then a message comes back to General Allenby saying that Abdul Baha's life is in danger, and, you know, should the British take Haifa, one of their first duties must be to protect Abdul Baha. Meanwhile, Abdul Baha, you know, a famous quotation that Baha'is often say of Abdul Baha is that he trod the spiritual pathway with practical feet. He was in Haifa, he knew the dangers, the Baha'is were very afraid, the whole population were afraid. Abdul Baha was peaceful and calm, and during this time, he sets himself the task. Again, he's approaching 70 now. He's a very elderly man. He doesn't stop still. He realizes that during the war, supplies are going to run out. And so he takes it upon himself to travel to a village in Jordan, and he gets people growing wheat and growing corn during the war years. He gets it transported back to Haifa by camel. At one time, 200 camels rode back brought these supplies back to Haifa, and it was due to Abdul Baha that the Baha'is and the whole of the population of Haifa did not starve during these war years because no supplies were getting through. So I'm just going to really press on now because I think it's almost time. We should be finishing quite soon now. But basically, General Allenby, they press on to Haifa. Now, there's another interesting twist to the story, just before I finish off. And the twist to the story is that General Allenby is now tasked with taking Haifa, and but most of the British troops that he had are being sent back to Europe because of the Western Front. So General Allenby is actually left with the Mysore and Jodhpur regiments from India, fine cavalrymen and fine horsemen. So what they have at their disposal now are these cavalrymen, wonderful soldiers from India, and but unfortunately the Turks and the Germans have armaments, they have guns. Allenby, in fairness, he did also have access to some planes, and he did bomb, you know, the other side did receive quite heavy bombing over Megiddo. But basically what happened, through lots of strategy, espionage, counter-espionage, good intelligence, these two cavalries, they went into Haifa, they split into four, one to surprise the enemy, really. They actually had no chance against this enemy at all. They were on horses and they had lances, they had no guns at all. He sent one lot north along the beach, another lot went up the mountain, another lot went in the marshes between the mountain and the seas, and a final lot were going just to go straight into Haifa. And they all came round on kind of four sides, and they rode valiantly into Haifa, facing machine guns. But I think the Turkish troops were so startled that they just scattered. They just ran out of the way. They charged in, and eventually Haifa was taken with hardly any. There was no bloodshed, actually, you know, with Haifa. And Abdul Baha had predicted this, you know, that this would happen. So they arrived into Haifa, and as promised, General Allenby sent a guard to go and protect Abdul Baha. Now, roll around to 2018 in July, and the House of Lords hold a reception for the Battle of Haifa, and this is as an accolade to the Jaipur and the Jodhpur Lancers and the Mysore Lancers, who were valiant in this battle. It was the last cavalry charge in the history of warfare, by the way, and I was fortunate enough to attend this event, and there were members of the Mysore and Jodhpur Lancers of today were attending the event, and I was talking to one of the guys, a Hindu guy, who in uniform, you know, from the army, and he told me that it was his grandfather who was sent to protect Abdul Baha in Haifa back then. Abdul Baha, as usual, was unperturbed. He'd carry on growing, you know, he was growing corn. He didn't feel he needed protecting, but anyway, he was. And they arrived in there. So just to finish off the story now, just a couple more slides. From this, Tudor Pole was delighted to be able to see Abdul Baha again. You know, he rode straight up and he saw him. And also, I think quite an interesting aspect is that General Allenby actually lived in Haifa for some time after the war, and it's really felt that we don't know what he had many conversations with Abdul Baha. We don't know what they spoke about, but in General Allenby's later speeches, he spoke of the need for peace. In his rectorial address at Edinburgh University just before the outbreak of the Second World War, Allenby said that world organisation, world consultation and cooperation are essential to world prosperity and international peace. They're as essential for the nations of the world today as for the 13 independent, competitive and self-centered states of America in the 18th century. So even General Allenby, who had fought through the First World War, he saw the need for peace. He said that the misunderstandings and petty quarrels between individuals, which often occur in the happiest family, but they are composed amicably without resort to a knife or pistol, so it should be in the case of bickering between nations. So I would say General Allenby had almost definitely been influenced through his conversations with Abdul Baha. And in fact, Abdul Baha was knighted by General Allenby in the 27th of April 1920. I think, sorry, this photograph is a little bit grainy. You can Google it later if you want a clearer one. Abdul Baha looks completely uncomfortable there. He sought no worldly titles whatsoever. And in fact, on the day, they'd sent out, you know, the usual kind of posh car to pick up Abdul Baha, and he couldn't be found anywhere. And everyone was out searching for Abdul Baha. Where was he for this particular ceremony? And he ended up coming in his usual horse and carriage, and he walked on foot into the ceremony. He never used the title. It meant nothing to him in that sense, but he, you know, in respect for, you know, General Allenby, he accepted it. And so Abdul Baha passed away in Haifa in 1921. This is a scene from his funeral. More than 10,000 people attended the funeral of Abdul Baha from every religious background. He had a telegram, Churchill sent a telegram across for this. There were speeches by rabbis, by Muslims, by Christian leaders, by the governor of Jerusalem. You know, it was just quite something to behold. Abdul Baha was everybody's friend, whatever race, whatever religion. And in fact, related to this, Wellesley Tudor Pole had one last service to provide for Abdul Baha, and that was Abdul Baha's beloved grandson and Shoghi Effendi was studying at Balliol College in Oxford. He was studying languages, and he was a young man in his 20s. he grew up with Abdul Baha. He loved him dearly. And Shoghi Effendi, of course, didn't know that Abdul Baha had passed away. So Wellesley Tudor Pole was asked to convey this news to Shoghi Effendi. And Shoghi Effendi came to Tudor Pole's office. The story goes that Tudor Pole had received the telegram. He left it on his desk. He popped out for a moment, and Shoghi Effendi appeared, read the telegram and fainted. And, you know, he was so shocked at the death of his beloved grandfather. So that was one last duty. And just to finish off with this quote, which I like, from Abdul Baha, because I think it describes, you know, some of the circumstances that we've been going through in recent weeks. Anyone can live contentedly in circumstances of ease and comfort, health and well-being, gratification and felicity, but to remain happy and contented in the face of difficulty, hardship, and the onslaught of disease and sickness, this is an indication of nobility. And I think Abdul Baha, more than anybody else, would have understood that. So that's it. I'm sorry, it's very long. It's a very long story, but I hope you all enjoyed it. So back to you, Steve or Kay. I'll just stop the.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed.